You're standing in a marble corridor. The air is thick with incense and something else, something metallic, like fear. Torchlight flickers against walls draped in silk the color of blood. From behind a golden door, you hear laughter, high, cruel, intoxicating. Then a scream. Not of pain, exactly. Something worse. Something that sounds almost like pleasure twisted into its opposite. The door opens. A woman emerges, her stola stained with wine. Or is it something darker? Her eyes meet yours, and in that moment you understand. In this palace, desire is a weapon, and she wields it like a blade. Her name will echo through 2,000 years of whispered scandal. Historians will argue over her legacy. Moralists will use her as a cautionary tale. But tonight, in the flickering shadows of imperial Rome, she is simply the most dangerous woman in the world. Before we descend into her world, and trust me, we're going deep, I'd love to know where you're watching from. It genuinely amazes me that a story from ancient Rome can still captivate people from São Paulo to Sydney, from Lagos to Los Angeles. Drop your location in the comments. This is the story of Valeria Messalina, third wife of Emperor Claudius, Empress of Rome, mother, murderer. And according to nearly every ancient source that survived, a woman whose sexual appetite was so insatiable, so transgressive, so utterly shocking that her name became synonymous with depravity itself. But here's what makes her story truly fascinating. We don't actually know where the truth ends and the propaganda begins. Rome, 38 AD. A girl of perhaps 14 or 15, sources disagree on her exact age, becomes the third wife of a man 30 years her senior. His name is Claudius, and he's a joke. A stammering, limping embarrassment to the imperial family, kept alive only because he seems too pathetic to threaten anyone's power. He drools when he speaks. He twitches. The palace guards mock him openly. Messalina is young, beautiful, and from one of Rome's most prestigious families. She's related to Augustus himself through her mother's line. This marriage isn't about love. It's about bloodlines, about keeping power within the right families, about producing heirs with impeccable pedigree. No one expects Claudius to ever become emperor. He's a placeholder, a genealogical dead end. Messalina could reasonably expect a quiet life of domestic obscurity, bearing a few children, managing household affairs, fading into comfortable irrelevance. Then, in January of 41 AD, everything changes. Caligula, the mad emperor, the monster who declared himself a god and allegedly tried to make his horse a consul, is assassinated. The Praetorian Guard, searching the palace for survivors of the imperial family, finds Claudius hiding behind a curtain, trembling with fear, and they proclaim him emperor. Suddenly, the stammering joke is the most powerful man in the world, and his teenage bride is Empress of Rome. Imagine that transformation. One day, you're married to a figure of ridicule. The next, you're the first lady of the greatest empire on earth. Every door opens. Every desire can be fulfilled. Every whim can become reality. For someone with Messalina's appetites, and make no mistake, even accounting for exaggeration, she clearly possessed extraordinary appetites, it must have felt like being handed the keys to paradise. Or perhaps to hell. Our sources for Messalina's behavior come primarily from three historians: Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. All three wrote decades after her death. All three belonged to the senatorial class that had every reason to despise her. And all three describe her behavior in terms so lurid, so extreme, so carefully detailed in their scandal that they read almost like pornography disguised as history. They tell us she would sneak out of the palace at night disguising herself with a blonde wig, and work in a brothel under the name Lysiska, the she-wolf, that she competed with Rome's most famous prostitute to see who could service more men in a single night, that she won, having taken 25 partners before finally admitting exhaustion as dawn broke, They tell us she maintained a private chamber in the palace where she would summon senators, knights, and even common citizens for her pleasure. That refusal was impossible, because to refuse the empress was to invite destruction. That she collected these encounters like trophies, each one a demonstration of her absolute power. They tell us she orchestrated elaborate theatrical productions in the palace gardens, where nobility performed sex acts for her entertainment. That she forced the wives of senators to participate, humiliating Rome's most distinguished families while their husbands watched helplessly. They tell us she was insatiable, that the more she had, the more she craved, that her desires weren't just sexual but political, that she used intimacy as a tool of domination, breaking the will of anyone who might challenge her authority. But here's what we need to understand. Rome had a very specific way of destroying powerful women. You didn't just kill them or exile them. You annihilated their reputation. You made them into monsters, into cautionary tales, into examples of what happens when women step outside their prescribed roles. Cleopatra was portrayed as a seductress who corrupted virtuous Roman men. Agrippina was painted as a poisoner and incestuous schemer. Poppaea was condemned as a husband-stealing manipulator. And Messalina? Messalina became Rome's ultimate symbol of female sexual transgression. The question isn't whether she did scandalous things. She almost certainly did. The question is, how much of what we're told is true, and how much is a carefully constructed nightmare designed to justify what would eventually happen to her? To understand Messalina, we need to understand her situation. She's young, probably still in her teens when Claudius becomes emperor. She's beautiful by all accounts. She's intelligent enough to navigate the deadliest political environment on earth. And she's married to a man who is simultaneously all-powerful and profoundly vulnerable. Claudius, despite his disabilities, proves to be a surprisingly competent emperor. He conquers Britain. He improves Rome's infrastructure. He reforms the legal system. But he's also paranoid, aware that he was never supposed to rule, surrounded by people who consider him illegitimate. He relies heavily on his freedmen, former slaves who now manage the imperial bureaucracy. Men like Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus wield extraordinary power, and Claudius, isolated and insecure, trusts them more than he trusts the traditional aristocracy. Into this power vacuum steps Messalina. As empress, she has the emperor's ear. She bears him children, a son, Britannicus, and a daughter, Octavia. This gives her legitimacy, makes her essential to the succession, and she uses this position ruthlessly. The ancient sources tell us she orchestrated numerous executions, that anyone who offended her, threatened her, or simply possessed something she wanted would be accused of treason, that she would sit with Claudius as he reviewed cases, whispering suggestions, pointing out threats, guiding his paranoia toward her enemies. Was she having affairs? Probably. Roman aristocratic women did, though usually with more discretion. Messalina's alleged behavior, the disguises, the brothels, the competitions, sounds more like male fantasy than reality. But the affairs themselves, those are historically plausible. Because here's the thing about Roman marriage among the elite. It wasn't about love. It was about alliances, property, and heirs. Claudius was decades older than Messalina, physically unappealing and frequently absent managing an empire. That she sought pleasure elsewhere wouldn't have been particularly shocking. What made it dangerous was the power dynamic. An empress taking lovers wasn't just adultery. It was a potential threat to imperial succession, to political stability, to the very structure of power. Every man she slept with became a potential rival to Claudius, a possible alternative emperor, a living question mark about the paternity of imperial heirs. This is why her sexuality was so carefully documented, so thoroughly scandalized. It wasn't really about morality. It was about power. And Messalina understood power very well. If even half of what we're told is true, Messalina didn't just pursue pleasure, she performed it. Her alleged behavior was public, theatrical, designed to shock and dominate. Consider the story of the wedding. This is perhaps the most infamous episode in her biography, the event that would ultimately destroy her. In the year 48 AD, while Claudius was away in Ostia inspecting the new harbor, Messalina went through a formal marriage ceremony with Gaius Silius, one of Rome's most handsome and distinguished senators. Not a secret affair, not a private indiscretion. A public wedding, complete with witnesses, priests, and all the traditional rituals. Why? What could possibly possess someone to do something so suicidally reckless? Some historians argue it was a coup attempt, that Silius was positioning himself to replace Claudius, and Messalina was securing her position for the transition. Others suggest she'd fallen genuinely in love and lost all sense of caution. Some even propose it was an elaborate fertility ritual, though this strains credulity. But there's another possibility, that Messalina had become so intoxicated by her own power, so accustomed to transgression without consequence, that she genuinely believed she was untouchable, that she'd spent years pushing boundaries, breaking taboos, humiliating Rome's elite, and nothing had stopped her. Until now. When news reached Claudius, even he couldn't ignore it. His freedmen, particularly Narcissus, seized the moment. They'd been terrified of Messalina's power, her influence over the emperor, her willingness to destroy anyone who threatened her. Now she'd finally gone too far. They surrounded Claudius, convinced him that Silius was planning to assassinate him, painted Messalina's wedding as the first move in a conspiracy, and Claudius, paranoid and frightened, gave the order. The end came quickly. Silius was arrested and executed, along with dozens of others implicated in the alleged conspiracy. Messalina fled to the gardens of Lucullus, ironically, property she'd appropriated from someone she'd previously destroyed. The sources give us different versions of what happened next. Tacitus, the most literary of the historians, stages it like a tragedy. He shows us Messalina with her mother Lepida, who'd come to convince her daughter to die with dignity rather than face execution. He describes her attempting to draft a petition to Claudius, begging for mercy, unable to find the words. Then the soldiers arrived. Messalina reportedly tried to stab herself but couldn't manage it. Her mother had to guide her hand. Even in death, she was performing. The tragic empress, the fallen woman, the cautionary tale in real time. She was perhaps 22 years old. Tacitus tells us that when news of her death reached Claudius, he was at dinner. He asked for more wine. He never mentioned her name again. Whether this represents shock, relief, or simply the pragmatic detachment of a survivor, we'll never know. Within a year, he'd married again, this time to his own niece, Agrippina, who would prove even more ruthless than Messalina had ever been. So, who was she, really? Strip away the propaganda, the sexual fantasy, the misogynistic caricature. What's left? We know she was young when she gained supreme power. We know she bore at least 2 children. We know she was politically active, involved in court intrigue, willing to destroy rivals. We know she ultimately overreached and paid with her life. Everything else is interpretation layered on fragments of biased history. The sexual stories, the brothel visits, the competitions, the theatrical degradations serve a very specific purpose. They transform Messalina from a political threat into a moral failure. They make her downfall seem inevitable, even justified. They warn other Roman women about the consequences of ambition, sexuality, and power. But they also reveal something about Roman anxieties. Messalina's story is ultimately about a woman who refused to be controlled, who used the same tactics, sexuality, violence, political manipulation, that Roman men used constantly without scandal, who claimed the privileges of power without the moderating shame that was supposed to keep women in their place. The horror, for ancient writers, wasn't really that she was sexual. It was that she was shameless. Roman men could visit brothels, keep mistresses, assault slaves, and maintain young male lovers without losing social standing. But a woman, especially a woman of the imperial family who claimed the same freedom. That was intolerable. So they made her into a monster. They detailed every alleged transgression, embroidered them into impossibility, and served them up as entertainment disguised as history. And we've been consuming that entertainment for 2,000 years. Messalina's name became shorthand for sexual depravity. Medieval writers used her as an example of womanly wickedness. Renaissance painters depicted her in brothel scenes, using classical history as an excuse for erotic art. Victorian scholars wrote about her with horrified fascination, their prose betraying rather more interest in the details than scholarly objectivity would require. She appears in juvenile satires, in medieval morality tales, in Renaissance paintings, in Victorian pornography, in 20th century novels and films. Each generation reshapes her to embody whatever that era fears most about women's sexuality and power. She's been interpreted as a victim of political conspiracy, as a genuine nymphomaniac, as a proto-feminist rebel, as a psychopath, as a misunderstood teenager destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. Each reading tells us less about Messalina and more about the interpreter. The truth, the actual historical truth, is probably mundane compared to the legend. A young woman who found herself in an impossible situation, who tried to secure her position through the tools available to her, who made powerful enemies, who miscalculated badly, and who was destroyed not just physically but reputationally, transformed into a cautionary tale that would outlive her by millennia. But that version doesn't satisfy us, does it? We want the monster. We want the woman so consumed by desire that she couldn't be satiated by 25 men in a single night. We want the empress who humiliated senators and corrupted the palace. We want the scandal. And that says something profound about us, about what we need from our historical villains, about how we use women's sexuality as a site of horror and fascination, about the stories we tell to make sense of power and its corruption. Standing in those same palace corridors today, now ruins open to the sky, you can almost hear the echoes. 2,000 years of gossip, scandal, moral outrage, and prurient fascination, all layered onto the memory of a young woman who lived and died before her 23rd birthday. Was she the monster? Or was she something far more dangerous? A woman who wanted power, who used the tools available to her, who refused to play by rules designed to keep her subjugated. The ancient sources wanted us to see a moral lesson. This is what happens when women transgress, when they claim sexual freedom, when they step out of domestic subordination into the realm of power. But perhaps the real lesson is different. Perhaps it's about how we transform women who threaten us into monsters, how we use sexuality as a weapon against them, how we write history to justify the violence we've already committed. Messalina died in a garden, murdered on her husband's orders before she could speak in her own defense, and then men spent the next 2,000 years speaking for her, creating her, shaping her, making her into whatever they needed her to be. The darkest pleasure of Empress Messalina isn't the one described in salacious detail by Roman historians. It's the pleasure we take in her story, the way we consume her destruction, judge her behavior, revel in her downfall, all while pretending we're learning history. She was Rome's most corrupt woman, they tell us. But Rome built gladiatorial arenas where people were torn apart for entertainment. Rome crucified thousands along its roads as warnings. Rome destroyed Carthage so completely they allegedly sowed the earth with salt. Rome built its empire on conquest, slavery, and systematic violence. And yet a young woman's alleged sexual transgressions are what history remembers as corruption? Perhaps Messalina's real crime wasn't what she did. It was refusing to disappear quietly. It was claiming space, demanding pleasure, exercising power in ways that made visible the hypocrisies at the heart of Roman masculinity. And perhaps that's why we're still talking about her, still fascinated and horrified, still trying to understand the woman behind the scandal. 2,000 years later, she's still the most dangerous woman in the room.